Hi, and welcome back to Harvard Voices on Climate Change. I'm Jim Stock. I'm the Vice Provost for Climate and Sustainability and Director of the Salata Institute. The Salata Institute, excuse me, is Harvard's hub for climate and sustainability. I'm also a professor in the Economics Department and the Kennedy School. Thanks for joining. First, some housekeeping. If you have questions, please submit them using the Q&A feature. But and I have an exciting guest. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. But before I do that, I just have to give you some exciting updates. So last month, if you joined us last month on Harvard Voices, we had Joe Aldi and Catherine Wolfram. Now, what they were discussing were two things. One was international carbon pricing border adjustments like the European CBAM. But they also discussed international climate agreements and something called the Harvard-MIT Global Climate Policy Project. One of the main activity of the Global Climate Policy Project, which has been working out of the Salata Institute for the last 9 months or so, led to an engagement with Brazil, and the orientation was around the purpose of the project, or purpose of this project, was to promote and to do the underlying research needed to make sure things were in order for creating a coalition of countries that would then be able to trade with the EU. I think Catherine mentioned that briefly last month when we had her on. Well, they worked with Brazil, and over the course of the last several months, including a presentation that they gave at New York Climate Week under the auspices of the Salata Institute, there was an announcement last week by Brazil, which announced this open coalition on carbon compliance markets. I'm going to drop this in chat if I'm able to. This is the announcement. That's our press release that links to the announcement. Anyway, it's a framework for carbon pricing aligned with the EU CBAM. Member countries are Brazil, China, the EU, UK, Canada, Chile, and there's other countries too. The Salata Institute doesn't take any policy positions, but we're delighted to be able to support our faculty's initiative when we see their work making such progress. So with that, I thought you'd be interested as a follow-up based on last month. So we have high hopes for George today in terms of follow-ups we'll be able to make for announcements. So let me turn to the topic today, which is corporate climate commitments. Over the past few years, companies have been adopting climate targets, building sustainability departments, and working towards decarbonizing their supply chains. Even before the change in administrations in Washington, these activities came under attack, and over the past 10 months, there's been significant change in the landscape of corporate commitments. The response to these changes has been mixed, though. Some companies seem to be making progress, other companies have retrenched, and some of the most visible alliances have basically ceased to function. So this is a complicated time, but it's not a time in which everybody's just like stopping making progress. So it's a really interesting opportunity to step back and think about what corporations are able to do in terms of making commitments, what those commitments lead to, how that changes, then reorients their business strategy, and how they move to a low carbon future. So we're going to discuss all of these things, the history, present, and future of corporate climate commitments today. We're fortunate to be joined by George Serafeim, the Charles M. Williams Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School, whose work has helped shape the understanding of how corporate purpose, environmental performance, and sustainability metrics intersect with financial markets and business strategy. So George, welcome, and let me turn it over to you.
Jim, thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be with you discussing such a timely, important topic, but also complicated topic. What I thought I would do is in the first 10 to 15 minutes, share some insights from different pieces of research that have happened across the university that I think can inform a baseline understanding of those corporate commitments. And then we can just open up and have I'm sure, an animating discussion. So let me share my screen so I can share a few insights and share a few slides. But what I thought we would do is just start from this picture, which is a a very complicated picture with different targets that that firms are announcing. And one of the things that you will see immediately is that there is no commonality in how those targets are being announced. So once an organization is setting a target, you will see that some of them will refer to carbon-free energy, some of them will refer to reducing intensity, some of them will mention about greenhouse gas emissions, some of them will say net zero emissions, some of them will be about scope 1, 2, and 3, some of them will be about scope 1 and 2. So there is a great amount of variance, I would say, in those targets that complicates things. So one of the things that I wanted to do is just to take a step back and use a simple example. I'm at the Harvard Business School, so we like to use cases when we discuss about things, and we like to do things in a very, very specific context because we believe that you learn a lot by digging deeper into one. So here is an example. So let's just take Apple. Obviously, almost all of you know Apple as a company. Probably you have an iPhone or a Mac or another product. But here is Apple's target. And I think it has several very interesting features here that we need to understand. So every commitment, and I would call commitments targets or goals that an organization is setting, has several features that are very, very important. The first feature, of course, is what you're observing here, which is we need to know the magnitude of the target. So in this case is 75%. So that is a very, very important feature of a target. The other element of a target is you need to know the baseline relative to what year you're talking about. So for example, here, the baseline, as you can see, is 2015. A third element that is very important is you need to know the target year, by when you're willing to try and achieve that target of 75%. Again, in this target, the goal is 2030 in this context. And of course, you need to know a fourth design parameter, which is what are you going to reduce in this case? So in this case, this target includes what they call as basically net emissions. So net emissions that also include scope 1, 2, and 3. As we discussed, other companies might be setting very, very different targets. Apple is setting net emissions on 1, 2, and 3. And then the other parameters that you see here are very, very interesting as well. The first one is that you're observing the baseline year in 2015, and Apple is saying 38.4 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. That's what you see next to the equivalent part, which means that they are converting other greenhouse gases. For example, look at methane, for example, and they are using a conversion factor to assign a conversion into carbon emissions. So all of those things are design choices that are differing across companies that I think are important for us to understand. The baseline year, the target year, the magnitude of the target, what is included in the target, all greenhouse gases, just carbon emissions, which carbon emissions, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and so forth, and whether the target is basically gross emissions versus net emissions. And as you're observing here, on terms of historical emissions, Apple is starting from 38.4 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent, and it's going down. So they're making progress towards achieving that goal. By 2024, they have reduced it to 15.3 million metric tons of emissions. And where does the net play out relative to the gross? It is that they are starting to purchase what you see here as a small amount of carbon offsets and removal credits. In this case is 700,000 of metric tons. So the net emissions then they are saying is 14.5. And then you observe the goal, and the goal has certain parameters. The first one, as you see, is that it's not zero gross emissions. So Apple is saying we're not going to be able to eliminate all emissions. we're going to reduce our emissions to the extent that we can, and then we're going to use negative emission technologies, meaning carbon offsets and removals, in order to go to net zero. And you see that as the gray line there and the white line. A couple of other things that are interesting here for you to observe is what you see basically as the dots that you see there, the grayed out lines that you see there. These are what Apple calls as avoided emissions. This is in climate language is called scope 4 emissions, which is basically what is the counterfactual? If Apple didn't make any effort, what would have happened, basically? So you can think about it, Apple working with suppliers to get zero carbon electricity or low carbon electricity. And they're basically saying, if we hadn't done that, if we hadn't worked with our suppliers to get that electricity in the manufacturing plants, our emissions would actually have increased over time. So they're showing that in terms of avoided emissions, and that's what you see here as the grayed out lines. Another interesting thing in the chart is that what you're observing is this bar charts, bar error lines that you see here, that Apple is saying they are emerging from emissions range from modeling uncertainty. This is a result of the fact that there are certain sources of emissions that you're modeling and you're estimating, but you don't know for sure that this is going to be the case. Let's take a simple example. So for example, if you're trying to estimate downstream emissions from product use from your iPhone or from your Mac, which comes from when you're charging them, you cannot be 100% sure what is the source of electricity that the consumer will be using when they're charging their Mac or their iPhone. As a result, there is modeling uncertainty around that, which is what you see as those error bars there. So several interesting features here for us to understand when companies are setting a target, what are the design choices that they are making, and how does this play out. And the other thing that I wanted to show you is that, for example, when you look at some of those emissions that are including in the targets, here is an example of Apple's comprehensive carbon footprint, meaning across scope 1, 2, and 3. Scope 1, as you can see, it's pretty small actually for Apple. Why? Because when they actually use energy, for example, when as part of their own operations, there isn't that much carbon that is generated. And that's why you see that, for example, when they are looking at scope 1, it's like really a very slim line. When you're looking at scope 2, it would have been a bigger line, but they're basically showing you how much is avoided because they're using so much renewable electricity. And what you see is that basically most of the emissions are coming from scope 3, primarily from product manufacturing, meaning upstream when you're manufacturing an iPhone, for example. And then the second big source is from product use, all the charging that is happening. If you're using your Mac to follow this webinar, you're just probably charging your Mac right now. So there are carbon emissions that have been generated in order to provide the electricity. And the third big component is product transport. So when the product is being transported to be distributed or to come to Apple and so forth. So that gives us a sense of some of the critical design choices that are part of those goals that companies are setting and what is included in those goals. I want to show you some data from the cluster research, from the net zero cluster research at the Harvard Salata Institute, that is a really great collaboration between the Harvard Law School, the Harvard Kennedy School, and the Harvard Business School. And not that often, actually, we collaborate across schools as a university. So this is a great example of Harvard coming together as one unit to do interdisciplinary research and bringing expertise from legal and policy and business to inform our understanding of an important phenomenon, which is in this case is those corporate commitments. So the cluster has been collecting data systematically on all climate-related targets that companies are setting. And here is a graph over time of how many targets you observe. You see an exponential increase in the number of targets that organizations have been setting over time. And when we are observing the question that we asked with Apple about what is included in those targets, what you see here is that most of the targets are falling in what the team here has called unspecified. This doesn't mean that we don't know what it is. This means that they're not related to a specific carbon scope, because many of those targets are energy targets. As a result, they are not relating to specific scope, but they are climate-related targets in most of those cases. And then what you're observing is that in terms of what is included in the target for companies is mostly scope 1 and 2. Is that surprising? To me, it's not, because scope 1 and 2 is what is mostly under the control of companies. It's more easily measurable, of course, but it's also more easily under the control of a company, because they're either their own emissions in terms of scope 1, so they can directly control it in their own operations, or it's easier to both measure but also probably move, because they're related to the electricity that they're purchasing or the heat that they're purchasing from the utilities. What you see then is that the third category is scope 3 emissions. Those can be either upstream and or downstream, upstream on their supply chain or downstream from product distribution and for product use, like the example that we're having with somebody charging their iPhone, or a bundle of like Apple, basically, that they are targeting scope 1, 2, and 3 together. And then we are observing fewer targets just for scope 1 or just for scope 2, and very, very few that bundle 3 with just 1 or 2. So that is giving you a sense about what is included in those targets. And as we'll see, this will make actually a difference. Here is also an interesting chart from the cluster research that shows you the average share of firms setting carbon targets within the Russell 3000 universe, which is an index of large cap companies, but also mid and small cap companies. And what you're observing here is that the largest share of firms that are setting carbon targets is coming from very high carbon intensive, basically, industries, as one might expect. For example, utilities or transportation or mining. Especially when you're looking at utilities and mining, these are also very high scope 1 type of companies. So you would expect that, one, they are able to measure to a great degree with accuracy their emissions, but also they have those emissions more under their direct control, relative to a company that most of the emissions might be in their supply chain, for example, and controlled by their suppliers. At the same time, though, what you're observing as well is that much lower percentage in industries that you might have expected a higher percentage. For example, look at the low percentage of manufacturing or construction. These are very energy intensive, very high carbon emission industries with much lower percentage of target setting. But some of that might be reflecting the difficulty of frankly lowering carbon emissions. Think about construction, for example. For many companies in that industry, this can be what is called a high cost to abate industry, because the solutions in order to reduce carbon emissions might be very costly. So you are observing a mix of the ability to control the emissions, and as a result being able to measure them and really take action to reduce them as a determinant of how widespread are those emissions, but also a reflection of the availability of technological solutions that might not be cost prohibitive at the same time. And that's another thing that we're observing. I wanted to say something about how emissions change over time. So far, we have been treating emissions as a monolithic concept, meaning total emissions. But in our research, we highlight this idea that emissions change for many reasons over time for a specific company. And I think that is a very, very important thing for us to recognize. So one of the things that we did basically a variance analysis here with Professor Shirley Liu, who is an assistant professor here at the Harvard Business School, and the doctoral candidate Trang Nguyen, who is on the job market this year. So we worked together on this paper, and we basically said, well, when emissions change year over year, if a company is going to meet those targets in a future year, emissions can change for many reasons. The first reason, and this is what we call real, is that the manager is taking some action, some real action that is lowering emissions. For example, it might be making a manufacturing process more energy efficient. So as a result, you can get the same amount of output, let's say the number of pencils that you create from a manufacturing plant, but you're using less energy. That's great because you have actually reduced emissions because you have actually become more efficient. Or you're taking an action, for example, you are swapping a high carbon intensity energy source to a lower carbon intensity energy source. Again, that is an action that the manager is making, and emissions are coming down. That's what we call real, basically, because it reflects real effort from the part of a manager. But there is another reason why emissions might change. For example, the output might change. For example, if you produce more pencils, well, emissions will go up probably. And if you produce fewer pencils, emissions will go down. So that is an output-related emission driver that we're isolating here. The third one is what we call measure. Emissions also change because measurement technologies are changing. For example, what is happening with many companies is that you're observing that their emissions over time are going up because they are actually increasing the boundary of the measurement. For example, they might not have been able to measure specific emissions from a manufacturing plant, and as their measurement technology is improving, now they can measure those emissions, so they are including them over time. So emissions change also because of measurement methodologies as they are evolving and as they are improving over time. The fourth element why they might be changing is what we call structure. So for example, a company might acquire, let's say you have 3 manufacturing plants, you acquire the manufacturing plant, well, your emissions are going up. Now you have a 4th manufacturing plant, or you might be selling part of your operations, in which case some emissions now are not yours, so you might not be including them anymore. So emissions can change for organizational structure reasons as well. And there is a very small component, as you can see, which is other. And what this graph is showing you, we have taken an average over a time period of emission changes that we have been able to decompose to its units. So for example, as you can see in this chart, emissions, the rate of total emission change year over year was about 2.9% negative, meaning that on average in the sample throughout that whole period, year over year, total emissions for the companies in the sample were decreasing by 2.9%. But the real reduction that is reflecting managerial effort was actually much greater, was 5.9% that managers were able to get through efficiency changes, getting lower carbon energy sources, redesigning products and processes, all of the things when they're working to reduce carbon emissions. And part of what is leading the gap from 5.9 to 2.9 is 1.44% positive that relates to output, meaning that those companies are growing. These are growing companies that are getting more output. 0.9% is because of measurement technologies improving. You didn't know that you had some emissions. You weren't able to measure them before. Your measurement technologies are improving. Now you're including them. And 0.57% is the net emissions from basically acquisitions minus divestitures. That's the way to think about it, right? Because more of those companies have been growing inorganically because they have been acquiring stuff rather than selling stuff, basically. And that is the net emission. And I think that is very important when we're thinking about basically hitting a target, because you can hit a target not because you're actually working hard towards it, but because, I set a scope 1 emission target, for example, and I sell my high carbon intensity unit, right? So that would be a structure, for example, emission change. Or I might miss my target, not because I'm not doing well, but because my measure emissions are going up. That's not a bad thing. I should be okay with that because I'm measuring more of those things now, and so forth. So you get the point that you really need to peel the onion and be able to understand why emissions are changing. And these are 4 fundamental reasons: managerial effort, output-related changes, measure-related changes, and structure-related changes. And this is what you see also when we decompose this and year by year. One of the things, and it's very interesting to us, that you're observing here is that there is real managerial talent and real managerial effort. As you can see here, the blue bar, which is the real bar, you're actually observing that the decarbonization attributed to real year over year is actually improving. Managers are actually getting better and better as technologies are improving. And of course, with a supporting policy environment to be able to find those efficiencies, implement those efficiencies, get to low carbon energy and so forth. But some of that is not translating to total emissions because of all the positive sides that you see there. These companies are growing at the same time, right? Because of output, they're acquiring other firms or facilities and production processes and so forth, which is the structure. And also measurement is improving over time. We're measuring more of those greenhouse gases, and that adds the green bar chart that you're observing there. So all of that is trading off. Another interesting view of this is to say, if I was doing a 2x2, and I was splitting the sample into total emission change, increase versus decrease, and real emission change, increase versus decrease, where would firms and years fall into that 2x2 quadrant, basically? I think that is a very interesting view. And what you're observing here is that when you're looking at real emission changes, so when you're stripping out production growth effects and measurement effects and structure effects, the reality is that most large companies have been able to, through their effort and their investments, to reduce basically real, right? So you observe, and that's why you see only 4% of firm years experience a real emission increase, basically. But what you're observing is that the real emission changes, 65% of that translates also to total emission change. So another way of thinking about that is that the real managerial effort is big enough to compensate for production effects and measurement effects and structure effects. And in 32% of the cases, it's just not enough. So the other, let's say the growth effect is just overwhelming managerial effort, and total emissions are increasing actually. So that is a very important, for me, that variance decomposition exercise is very important for us to be thinking about when we're thinking about it in the context of climate targets, because how you reach the target is very, very important. We want to be reaching targets because we're having real emission reductions, basically. Another important element for us to think about a little bit is about this question of ambition. I started and I said the first design choice when you're thinking about the target is how much. In the context of Apple, in the example of Apple, we saw and we said 75% is what they said. And then we said, okay, for what, for how many years, and so forth. So that is a very important element. And I think one question that we can ask and think about the target ambition is should we be ambitious? Should we be ambitious? If you set a very hard target to reach, it can be hard actually to reach it. And as a result, there is a cost-benefit analysis that you can do when you're setting a more ambitious target. And I want to take from an older paper of mine here that we published back in 2016 that informs a little bit this question about should we be ambitious. And one of the things that we found in this paper, and perhaps it's a little bit counterintuitive, is that we found a positive relation between setting a more difficult target and achieving that target. And you should take a step back and say, hold on, George, like, what are you saying here? That if I set for myself a more ambitious target, I should be more likely to miss the target, not to actually reach the target, because the target is more difficult. So why are we observing that? And for us, in this context of this paper, goes back to really goal-setting theory. That is a theory about human motivation. And the idea that actually sometimes when you set more ambitious targets, that really energizes the team and energizes an organization to try and achieve that more ambitious target. And this is one of the things that we observed here. And one of the things that we observed was also that this was especially true if completing the target required the development of more novel knowledge inside the organization. So that relationship, you didn't observe it if the target would have to be achieved really by just spending more money, let's say. Then you weren't observing that relationship. But when it required actually the development of more coordination, collaboration inside the organization, transferring knowledge, learning new things, finding those efficiencies, for example, in the manufacturing process, we actually found that setting a more ambitious targets, you were more likely to complete a higher percentage of that target and hit that target. That goes back to motivating. Of course, there is a trade-off also when we're thinking about targets that might be in the nature of net zero, science-based targets, really ambitious targets for an organization, which is this trade-off. I teach this as part of a case that I have written for my course as well, about how do you set targets to motivate people inside the organization. And of course, ambitious targets have this motivation perspective that they can unleash innovation and creativity inside the organization. You know, if you say to people, let's go to the moon, you might actually get to the moon because this is human nature. People are ambitious. They want to do great things, right? So I think, you know, Elon Musk has proven that to many people with many of his companies, the idea that you need to dream big, right? Go to Mars or something. But also, ambition inside the company attracts a lot of people. You know, that's why a lot of my students, for example, they have gone to work at Tesla, or they have worked at Tesla, because that grand ambition also motivates people. But what is the trade-off? The trade-off is really credibility. That if you set very ambitious targets, you might be worried about missing those targets in a systematic way, which then can raise credibility questions internally with employees. Does management know where we need to go and how we can go there? But also externally with markets, especially with investors. If you keep setting targets and you miss them, we see that all the time with companies. For example, if they set earnings targets that then they miss, they get penalized most of the cases in capital markets as well. So there's really a credibility question that we need to be thinking here when we're thinking about corporate commitments and setting ambitious targets. There's also a question about what happens when actually targets mature. So what happens? So as I mentioned, my colleague here, Shirley Liu, has a fascinating paper that they have published recently in Nature Climate Change, that they looked at what happened to the corporate emission targets that were due in 2020. So they analyzed a little bit more than 1,000 companies and their Scope 1 emissions. And what they found was about 61% of those targets were achieved. So the companies actually achieved them. And they found that about 8.5% of those targets failed, And that's okay, right? Sometimes, especially if you set ambitious targets, sometimes you will fail your target. It's you asking me to run like 100 meters in like 9 seconds. I will fail that target, but I'll try really hard. And if I get to 11 seconds, that's pretty good, or 12 seconds, right? But I think the more intriguing thing that they found was that actually almost 31% of those targets, what they call disappeared, meaning that the company didn't follow up about what happened with that target. And I think that is a really interesting fact about what Shirley and her co-authors found in this paper. The other interesting thing that they found was that out of the 88 firms with a failed target, only three were covered by the media. So only three had some information intermediation function to it. It had some type of accountability that related to the fact that the target wasn't met. And the authors of the paper talk a lot about this missed opportunity for learnings. Because even when you miss a target, you can learn something from it. But because really the institutions are not really paying attention, there's no information intermediaries really that are paying attention to that. That is a missed opportunity. And then from an accountability perspective, in that paper, they don't really find any evidence of consequences for failing targets. They don't observe, for example, any significant stock market reactions or changes in media sentiment or shareholder proposals on environmental issues. So in some sense, we can think about commitments in the form of targets, but the commitments are only credible commitments if they have some cost associated to that, right? That's what makes credible commitment. And in this paper, they find the lack of credibility because they don't find really any accountability mechanisms that are happening from information intermediaries and institutions. So the last slide that I will have, and I'll take it back, is that when we think about the left side of what you see here, for example, when companies set earnings targets, you have a whole set of institutions that we have developed as a society, ranging from accounting standards on how earnings are being measured, and then auditors that certify those earnings and the processes that comply with GAAP and so forth. You have the Securities and Exchange Commission about how you disclose those targets and so forth. And then you have a follow-up on those targets from information intermediaries such as sell-side analysts and Wall Street analysts, and then, of course, investors that are dissecting that information. And I think we are still in the early stages of those institutions as it relates to emission targets and those corporate commitments. Of course, you have reporting standards in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, in the ISSB, that is part of the IFRS Foundation. You have some auditing that is happening with most of the cases limited assurance. That is a more narrow level of assurance about emissions. And then you have, I would say, probably limited amount of enforcement mechanism and limited amount, as we saw in the previous paper, also of monitoring that is happening around those institutions. So I think that institutional perspective is also something important for us to keep in mind as we're thinking about the ability for those commitments and targets to translate into meaningful real emission reductions, and having an accountability structure for those targets to translate into credible commitments. Jim, I'll pass it back to you. I hope that foundation is useful for everybody on the line, for us to understand some of the basics about how those targets are being set, what they include, the design choices including into them, how total emissions could be decomposed to several sources of emission changes, and then some of the consequences and what we're observing in terms of the targets.
George, that was just terrific. That is a lot to digest, and there's a lot there to discuss. So maybe I could just follow up I want to start with just one or two technical questions. So I could just, or more narrow questions, just follow up on that last slide and thinking about the lack right now, at least in the United States, of a regulatory structure that would validate what your emissions actually are or any of that. I know there was and this is probably not exactly the same thing, but there was a rule that the SEC had, I think, last year on disclosure of climate risks. I don't know if that actually covered emissions, but maybe you could talk a little bit about, with a little more specificity, what does the regulatory landscape look like, and in the United States, what does it look like in Europe, and is there any real hope for some validation or credible validation of these corporate emission targets? And let me just, I forgot to remind everybody, and so few folks are doing it. I have pre-submitted questions, but please drop some additional questions in chat, in Q&A, not chat, but Q&A.
Thank you, Jim, for the question. When you're thinking about the regulatory structures as it relates to emissions measurements and disclosures about emissions, I think there are a couple of adjectives that characterize this process. The first one is that it's highly uneven around the world. So different jurisdictions have very different regulatory structures, very different disclosure requirements, and so forth. In general, around the world, when we think about measuring emissions, most of the existing regulations will refer to the greenhouse gas protocol or some ISO-specific measurement process. So that is the first key point. The second key point is that, not surprisingly, a lot of organizations struggle to measure with accuracy their Scope 3 emissions. Okay. As a result, and you mentioned also the now withdrawn, or I don't know if it's withdrawn, but it will be if it's not already, SEC proposed regulation that focused on Scope 1 and 2 emissions, and including Scope 3, subject to the organization setting a target for it. So if you had set a target for it, then it was a fair game for you. Since you set the target, it means that you can measure it pretty accurately. As a result, you should disclose it. But that rule didn't have a specific mandatory disclosure regulation for Scope 3. Now, that is an important point here that I think we need to talk a little bit about. Scope 1 emissions and Scope 2 emissions are really realized emissions, right? In the sense that they have already happened. Scope 3 emissions downstream are estimates of future emissions that in many ways are also multi-year emissions, right? So there is a discrepancy here between what we're measuring when we're measuring Scope 1 and Scope 3, which is our realized, which is an accounting concept, versus Scope 3 downstream, which are in many ways future emissions. So think about the example of a car, BMW provides the car. Scope 1 BMW emissions are realized emissions. Scope 3 downstream BMW emissions are actually from driving the car for years to come. These emissions haven't happened yet, and also they cover multiple years. And then Scope 3 upstream emissions, which are realized emissions, much like Scope 1 and 2, but the difference there is that they're much harder to measure, basically, because you need to actually understand data from suppliers. And what is happening is that most of the companies are using some kind of average estimates in order to estimate this Scope 3 upstream data, because they just don't have data from all of their suppliers. And you can think about it in the simple context of I have 3 suppliers, but now think about Walmart and you have 10,000 suppliers. It's just a gigantic effort, right? So that's one. As a result, why am I saying all this? Most regulations around the world, they always put a lot of emphasis, even when you mentioned before about carbon border adjustment taxes and so forth. That is a lot resting on Scope 1 emissions and so forth, right? So, and then people will rightly make the criticism and ask the question about, well, what if I'm transferring emissions from scope 1 to scope 3, and then I can just game the system basically. So I have basically my own emissions, and then I lease something, and suddenly through leasing and sale it back, it has become scope 3 emission, right? So you have a couple of those things. Then in general about disclosure, what is happening around the world, I would say to a large extent, disclosure has been driven by voluntary market activities rather than by regulatory activities around the world. So when you're observing that, and you observe how companies came about disclosure, for example, an organization like the Carbon Disclosure Project, CDP, that sources basically data from companies to meet the demand of institutional investors on the other side. So you can think about an organization of CDP like a platform connecting the suppliers of information, being the issuers, the companies, to the demand of information, being institutional investors. That is one platform. Or the demand of information being large companies to the suppliers of information, meaning suppliers in their supply chain. Think about Walmart versus all their suppliers. Those are two platforms that they have built. That has been a huge driver of corporate disclosure and transparency. And voluntary activities, of course, can create quite a bit of transparency because of the classic theory of the lemons, right? That you don't want to be seen as a lemon, so reputation really works, right? So, and you get that unraveling over time through accounting and through disclosure. But if you want to get numbers that can be elevated to the same level of accuracy and credibility as with the financial accounting numbers, then you actually need some type of regulatory structures. And you need to embed those numbers into credible, auditable, verifiable, and channels and distribution mechanisms, such as, for example, the 10K, that has so many guardrails around it, from auditing to litigation to regulatory oversight. And as a result, that tends to elevate the credibility and the accuracy of the numbers. That doesn't exist so far.
Yeah. Well, you are walking into this is a perfect setup for the current carbon accounting debate around scope 2 and scope 3 in particular. There was a paper that you're well aware of or an article in Harvard Business Review back in 2021 by Robert Kaplan and Karthik Ramana, where they pointed out that the standard way that scope 3 accounting is done double counts, especially if you're looking downstream, because you're double counting scope 1 emissions by a downstream customer.
Upstream as well. Jim, is the same thing. Upstream as well.
Absolutely. That's their point. And so they have a mechanism that they propose. I mean, stepping back, there's a basic identity, which is that the total amount in the total amount of global emissions is equal to the sum of scope 1 emissions.
That's simple.
Because a molecule goes up a smokestack or out a tailpipe, and that's what it is.
Yeah.
And you can look at that two different ways. One is just let's add up the scope 1, or you can parse out all those pieces of scope 1 that's done along the supply chain, and then you can call that a different flavor, a different version of scope 3. And that's what their paper points out, and they use this thing called e-liabilities. I wonder if you could, I suspect a number of our audience members are pretty sophisticated and are aware of this. But like, where does that fit in? That's a different framework. It's not part of the greenhouse gas accounting protocols at the moment. Like, where does that fit in? And if you're, a company that's trying to take this seriously, how do you think about that? I know there's a big push by some companies and some institutes in terms of trying to elevate this.
Yeah. So it's a simple idea, right? As you said, Jim, at its core, and Bob is a colleague here, and he's a titan of corporate accounting. And I think he makes a very important point, right? Which is basically when you're observing, as we discussed before, basically some of those emissions are realized, some of them are not realized, and some of them are estimates, and some of them are not they can be more reliably be measured. And there's double accounting. Somebody's Scope 3 emissions, somebody else's Scope 1 emissions, right? The question becomes, and this is where the debate rests, is what are you trying to achieve? So if you can actually, if all what you want to do is to create an accounting system that measures for all companies Scope 1 emissions, if you can force all companies, but not all companies, really at any point of consumption or production, the measurement of Scope 1 emissions, then problem solved. So if you made me the benevolent dictator of the whole world, I'll say, well, Jim, you measure your Scope 1 emissions, and all organizations measure Scope 1 emissions. Problem solved. And deposit all your data somewhere centralized so we can calculate everything. Problem solved, right? And that would be the first best, basically, solution, right, that you would be doing. Unfortunately, we don't live in the world where George can do whatever he wants. And most organizations are not going to calculate or disclose those emissions. And of course, a lot of emissions are happening not at the organizational level, but by consumers, basically, right? When we're doing stuff, when you drive your car, a lot of emissions, right? So then the question is what are you trying to do? If what you're trying to do is basically expand the span of accountability for an organization to go upstream and downstream and take accountability for some of those emissions, then it makes sense to have some of those Scope 3 measurements. And almost like the double counting and the overlap of emissions is not a bug of the system, but it's actually a feature, because you're trying to make the company and its suppliers, or to think about the company and its customers as interconnected systems that they need to collaborate. So you want actually to have some of that double counting. On the other side, if you don't want to do that, if you don't want to expand that span of accountability, and you want to basically make the span of accountability what you are actually controlling, which is your Scope 1 emissions, then you want to align those two things and have that accounting system that focuses on just Scope 1 emissions. So for me, it just goes back to, can you make everybody have Scope 1 emissions, in which case you actually don't need all this other stuff? And if you don't, then can you reliably measure as an organization those Scope 3 emissions? And are you able to create collaboration across the value chain by creating some of that double counting? For me, it comes down to that simple question.
Yeah, I mean, we've had this conversation before, and I have to say, when you said, I mean, I'm an economist, so the double counting argument resonates with me. But I have to say, it's a really interesting observation that perhaps the double counting is a feature, not a bug, and it depends on your theory of change. If you think that really it's not about getting the accounting exactly right for Apple, it's about Apple talking to its suppliers and getting them to provide cleaner upstream products and reduce their Scope 1 emissions. And that's a really interesting observation.
Yeah, I think both approaches have strengths, and they have like a theory of change, just different theories of change.
Yeah, exactly. It's interesting. So there are a whole bunch of questions. Let me shift gears a little bit and talk about the relationship between corporate targets and corporate emissions targets. Oh my gosh, we're so late on time. My goodness, there's so much. We'll have to be quick. Corporate relation targets and policy. So there is a strand of this, which is, policy is having difficult policy in the United States. Let's just say it's not as durable as one might want. So maybe corporations will come to the rescue here, and corporations will just say this is the right thing to do. On the other hand, economists like me might say, are you kidding? Corporations live in this world of incentives. Policy provides incentives. What's your view? What's your take on sort of the relationship between the role of policy in terms of setting the landscape and the role of corporate disclosures, or corporate targets?
It has a huge role. There is no doubt about it. We just published a paper in Nature Communications where we basically we developed basically a large language. We fine-tuned the large language model to go through all business descriptions of 10K reports to understand how companies are developing climate solutions, meaning they see actually the transformation of the energy system and material system as an opportunity to develop innovative products. You can think about it, waste to energy solutions, electric vehicles, hydro, all of those kinds of things. And one of the things that we observed, to your point, is that there was a huge driver of this was, for example, the Inflation Reduction Act, renewable portfolio standards, and so forth. So for me, there's no doubt. I mean, it's businesses don't do things because you're trying to burn money. I think one of the most important thing to recognize and the distinguished characteristic of business is that you have competition. In many other institutions, competition is not as much of an important force when you're thinking about government, for example, or some of the other institutions. But in businesses, especially in most industries, it's a ruthlessly competitive environment. So what I always say is that you're not going to have positive impact if you don't win competitively. And you cannot win competitively if you make yourself uncompetitive. So a business, even if it has the most climate conscious leader, will be constrained by the forces of competition and will be able to make progress as a function of its, of course, innovative capacity. And we have seen many examples that even without policy, companies have been able to find efficiencies and lower cost of production and do many, many wonderful things. But policy is a gigantic lever and an accelerator. And without a supporting policy environment, I think you will observe that many of those solutions that we need in order to reduce carbon emissions or become more resilient, they are not going to scale up as quickly or to the same extent.
Yeah. Oh, that makes sense. And it also is interesting in your chart, on page 9 of your deck, where you ranked the percentage of targets by industry, that the industries that had the largest fractions of targets, like utilities and transportation and oil and gas extraction, are some of the ones that are most heavily regulated, or at least have the threat of being most heavily regulated, or at times have been regulated and then not regulated in this space. And so it makes sense that those would then be the ones that were saying, well, we're doing all of this anyway, or we're going to be doing it, or going to have to do it. So let's get a little bit ahead of the game and let's do it an emissions target, and then the consumers, the public, will realize that we're on board. So so there clearly seems to be some interplay.
And Jim, there is also, I think, an important almost organizational behavior perspective on emission target, right? Which is basically sometimes what you want to do as a leader inside the organization, you want to signal to all your employees where you're going to go.
Yeah.
Because you have competing beliefs and interests even inside your own organization. You have multiple units, multiple divisions, and multiple people. Sometimes you want to signal to everybody about where we're going.
And sometimes that's successful and sometimes it isn't. So BP is a perfect example of some very strong signaling and then some, substantial retrenchment. So
you need to do your homework. You need to do your homework, right?
Yeah, in a big way. So we are actually at time. There was a question that said there's some really cool charts, there's some interesting papers, what we'll do is we'll talk with George and we'll figure out a way to post those so that those links are going to be available. I especially recommend the one that just came out last week that you mentioned, which is also with your colleague Shirley Liu, looking at using AI to try to understand what corporations are doing and then seeing their response to policy. So that's a fascinating paper. I enjoyed reading it myself. So I'm just going to say thank you very much, George. This was super interesting, and I'm really glad to see that we're continuing to make progress in this area. And for the audience, thank you very much for joining us. Look forward to seeing you again in December, and enjoy the rest of your evening.